This is the document that the Iranian regime never wanted Donald Trump to finish reading. A 10-point peace proposal, crafted in Tehran, delivered to the White House through Pakistani mediators. Weeks of back-channel negotiations, ceasefire promises, and diplomatic signals, all leading to this single piece of paper. Trump called it garbage, not diplomatically, not carefully, garbage. He said, and I am quoting directly, "I didn't even finish reading it." This is Monday, May 11th, 2026. And as of this morning, the ceasefire between the United States and Iran is, in Trump's own words, on massive life support. This is not a story about a failed diplomatic letter. This is the story of a region standing at the edge of a second war, bigger, broader, and more destructive than the one that started on February 28th. The myth that diplomacy would smoothly follow military victory, that Iran would simply fold, surrender its nuclear material, and accept Washington's terms, that myth is now cracking under the weight of reality. Make no mistake, what happened this week in Washington is not a negotiating tactic. It is a signal, and the entire Middle East is reading it. Let's start with what actually happened. The proposal Iran sent and Trump rejected. Here's what you need to understand about Iran's peace proposal. It was not nothing. Iran's 10-point counterproposal, reviewed by Pakistani mediators and delivered to Washington, included several significant concessions, ending hostilities on all fronts, guaranteeing maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz, and opening a pathway to nuclear discussions. Iran was signaling a phased approach: end the shooting first, then negotiate the harder issues, enrichment, sanctions, missile programs, in a second stage. To Tehran, that was a reasonable sequencing of priorities. To Trump, it was a delay tactic. The White House had been pushing a 14-point memorandum of understanding, a one-page framework crafted by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner that demanded Iran commit to nuclear red lines before any formal talks began. Zero enrichment. Removal of 408 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, enough, U.S. officials said, for multiple nuclear weapons. Enhanced snap inspections by UN monitors. Underground nuclear facilities shut down permanently. Iran's response did not include any of that. None of it. Trump read the letter, or didn't finish it, and then went in front of cameras and said the ceasefire was the weakest it had ever been. That should have been a wake-up call for Tehran. It was. But here's where it gets worse. The Pentagon debate, nobody is fully reporting. Now here's the part that most outlets are covering too lightly. Inside the Trump administration, there are two camps, and they are pulling in opposite directions. Camp 1, centered inside the Pentagon, is arguing for a return to targeted strikes. Not a full resumption of war, something more surgical, precision pressure. Strikes designed to further degrade Iran's negotiating position and force Tehran back to the table on Washington's terms. Officials in this camp believe diplomacy without military credibility behind it is just conversation. And right now, they argue, Iran is stalling. Camp 2, centered around the diplomatic track, is arguing to give talks more time. Let the Pakistani mediators push harder. Let the economic pressure of the naval blockade do its work. Iran's economy is bleeding. The Strait of Hormuz, closed since early March, has choked off roughly 20% of global oil supplies. Brent crude is trading above $104 a barrel. That pain is real. Give it more time. Trump is listening to both camps, and publicly, he is threatening both paths simultaneously. Asked directly by a reporter whether he might restart strikes on Iran, Trump replied, "If they misbehave, if they do something bad, it's a possibility that could happen." That is not a denial. That is a loaded statement, delivered deliberately. Make no mistake, when a president uses the phrase, "it's a possibility," in the context of military strikes, that is not casual language. That is calibrated pressure. The question is whether Tehran is calculating correctly what it means. The nuclear math that makes this different from every previous negotiation. Let's get technical about what that means, because the nuclear numbers in this negotiation are unlike anything the world has faced before. Iran currently holds more than 408 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, 60% enriched. U.S. officials have confirmed that this stockpile is sufficient to produce multiple nuclear warheads if enriched further to weapons grade. The U.S. negotiating position is absolute, that material must leave Iran, physically removed, possibly transferred to American custody. Iran's position, stated publicly and repeatedly, is that its nuclear program is peaceful and that enrichment is an inalienable right. Tehran has proposed a 5-year moratorium on enrichment. Washington has demanded 20 years. The parties are currently, reportedly, somewhere around 12 to 15 years as a possible landing point. But here is what the moratorium debate misses entirely. The material already enriched, the 408 kilograms sitting in Iranian facilities right now, that is the core issue. And Iran has not agreed to move it, not publicly, not formally. Two sources with knowledge of the talks told Axios that Iran might agree to remove the highly enriched uranium. One option discussed was transferring it to the United States, but that has not been confirmed. Tehran has not signed off. Read those numbers again. 408 kilograms, 60% enriched. Enough for multiple bombs. That is what Trump is refusing to leave on the table. That is what the entire negotiation is actually about. Every other detail, the Strait, the sanctions, the inspections, is secondary to this one irreducible fact. Iran has the material. The U.S. wants it gone. And right now, they cannot agree. The Strait of Hormuz and the global energy crisis. Here's what you need to understand about the Strait of Hormuz, because this is not just an Iran story, this is a global economy story. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrowest choke point in world energy. Approximately 20% of global oil supplies pass through this waterway every day, without exception. Saudi oil, Emirati oil, Kuwaiti oil, Qatari liquefied natural gas. When Iran effectively sealed off the strait in early March, deploying mines, drones, missiles, and fast attack craft, it did not just threaten American warships, it triggered a global energy crisis. Brent crude jumped past $100 a barrel. Gas prices across Europe and Asia spiked. Shipping insurance rates exploded. Major shipping companies rerouted away from the Persian Gulf entirely, adding thousands of miles and billions of dollars in costs to global supply chains. The United States responded with a naval blockade on Iranian ports, beginning April 13th. Escorted convoys, U.S. destroyers flanking commercial vessels through the strait, and still the attacks continued. Just this week, U.S. forces struck an Iranian-flagged oil tanker, the MT Hasna, in the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel was allegedly violating the U.S. naval blockade. U.S. Navy ships fired on the tanker, disabling it. France has now moved the Charles de Gaulle Carrier Strike Group into the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. Britain is coordinating on freedom of navigation operations. The UAE, which has experienced repeated Iranian drone and missile strikes on its territory, has expelled Iranian diplomats. This is not a regional skirmish. This is a global disruption event, and it will not end until the nuclear question is resolved. Stage 1, the military phase, complete. Stage 2, the diplomatic phase, is now failing in real time. Israel's role and the threat that changes everything. Now let's talk about Israel, because Israel is the variable that nobody in this negotiation fully controls. Israel strongly opposed the negotiations from the beginning. Israeli officials lobbied Washington directly against a diplomatic settlement that would leave Iran's nuclear infrastructure intact. Prime Minister Netanyahu told CBS News' 60 Minutes that the conflict was not over, and that if negotiations failed to extract Iran's nuclear material, Israel could re-engage them militarily. That is Benjamin Netanyahu on American television, reserving the right to strike Iran unilaterally if he doesn't like the deal Trump makes. Think about what that means. Trump is negotiating a peace deal. Israel is threatening to blow up that peace deal by launching its own strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. An Israeli official, briefed on the state of talks, told Army Radio this week that Israel had been preparing for an escalation and was not aware that Trump was close to an agreement. Israeli officials were preparing for war, while American diplomats were preparing a peace memo. That gap between what Washington wants and what Jerusalem is planning is now one of the most dangerous fault lines in the world. Make no mistake, If Israel strikes Iranian nuclear facilities without U.S. authorization, it does not just restart the war. It potentially restarts the war on Iran's most favorable terms, with Tehran able to claim victimhood, rally regional allies, and justify the most extreme retaliation it has available. The next 30 days will determine whether that scenario becomes reality. Watch this space. Iran's internal division and why that makes a deal harder. Here's where it gets worse for the Iranian side. Because Tehran is not negotiating as one unified government. It is negotiating as a fractured system, trying to find internal consensus while under external military and economic pressure. Trump himself acknowledged this publicly. He said Iran's new leaders, those who took over after their predecessors were killed in the February 28th strikes, including the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, had been more reasonable. But more reasonable does not mean unified, and it does not mean empowered to make binding decisions. The White House has confirmed that the first round of talks collapsed because the Iranian negotiating team had to return to Tehran to get approval to sign a deal. They were at the table. They reached a point of potential agreement, and then they had to go ask permission. That is not a negotiating partner. That is a committee. Multiple U.S. officials told CNN that American intelligence believes Iranian leadership is divided. Hardliners resisting any nuclear concessions, pragmatists willing to deal in exchange for sanctions relief and economic survival. The problem is, neither faction has clearly won, and divided governments make terrible negotiating partners under military threat. Iran's economy is catastrophic. The strait closure has cut off its primary export revenues. Sanctions have frozen billions in assets abroad. Inflation is spiraling. Protests, which began before the war, have only intensified since the strikes. There are Iranians inside the country who have begged Western governments to not negotiate with the current regime at all, but to support democratic transition instead. That is the pressure cooker Tehran is negotiating from. And somehow, within that chaos, they have to find a unified answer to America's nuclear demands within the next 48 hours. What Trump actually wants and why the deal is so difficult. So what happens next? Let's talk about Donald Trump, because his psychology in this negotiation is not speculation. It is visible. Trump launched this war with one stated objective: not regime change, not regional stability, not the Strait of Hormuz, one objective. Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. He has said it in every public statement, every press conference, every Oval Office answer to reporters. The nuclear question is not a negotiating chip for Trump. It is the entire game. Everything else, sanctions relief, frozen assets, maritime security, proxy groups, is downstream of that single red line. And Iran sent him a letter that didn't say it. That is why Trump called it garbage. That is why the ceasefire is on life support. Not because of diplomatic misunderstanding, not because of miscommunication through Pakistani mediators, because Iran's letter did not contain the three words Trump needed to see: no nuclear weapon. That assumption that Iran could finesse the nuclear question by pushing it to a later phase of negotiations is now dead. Iran has approximately 48 hours, as of the latest reporting, to respond to the U.S. position with something concrete, something that addresses the nuclear material directly. If that response does not come, or if it comes in the same form as the last one, the Pentagon officials arguing for resumed strikes will have the argument they need. And Trump has already told you the answer. It's a possibility that could happen. The historical frame. History books will record February 28, 2026, as the day the United States and Israel struck Iran and changed the Middle East forever. They will record the death of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who built Iran's nuclear program, funded its proxies, and called Israel a cancerous tumor, killed in American airstrikes. But the chapter being written right now, this week, these 48 hours, may matter just as much. Because the question is not whether the US can destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That question was answered on February 28th. The question is whether the United States can force Iran to permanently, verifiably, irreversibly surrender its nuclear ambitions through diplomacy, while a ceasefire hangs by a thread, while Israel prepares its own military options, while global oil markets teeter above $100 a barrel, and while a divided Iranian government struggles to find an answer its various factions can live with. That is the hardest diplomatic challenge in the world right now, and it is happening in real time. Make no mistake, the next deal or the next strike will define the Middle East for the next generation.